This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
Okay, so I wanted to do a video kind of about which I pick out of the Podgo or the HoTone Ampero Stomp, the Ampero 2 Stomp. So the Ampero designed, manufactured in China, and there's not a huge amount of presence on YouTube with the Ampero 2 Stomp. I don't know if there's a team of people that actually interact with people like me. I'm not so sure. If you do work for HoTone, give me a shout, because it'd be interesting to hear from people at the actual company. And then, of course, 9.6 we all know of. And the Podgo was kind of designed to be their cheapest take on the kind of Helix amp modelling and all that stuff. The things that you miss out on here are, first of all, MIDI. So that's one thing that your HoTone Ampero 2 Stomp does still have, MIDI. The other thing is, the key difference that for me might be a deal breaker is that this cannot do more than one amp in a preset. So the HX Stomp, by the way, which is probably what I would choose over the HoTone Ampero, can do dual amp presets and stuff like that. The Podgo cannot. It's kind of a bit more limited in that way, to keep it more simple. Now, in terms of what's in there, let's kind of think about amp models and stuff like that. I think they're pretty comparable. They've both got a good range of amps from clean to high gain. This isn't so much like the Neural DSP where there's sort of a limited choice of amps still at the moment. They really do have quite a bunch of amps. Now, I'll flash some up on screen, but for instance, there's Trainwrecks in both of them. There's Bogner amps, there's the Lone Star from Mesa Boogie. There's kind of most of the staples of what you might need. There's also a really good choice of effects on both of them. There's no poly pitch effects on the Pod Go. There are some on the HoTone Ampero Stomp 2, but they're not great, I would say. I think they sound a little bit glitchy, not amazing. In terms of effects choice, I think in general they're both pretty excellent. I think the new dynamic plate and the dynamic hall, these effects on the Line 6, which were brought over by a guy called Norm, who used to work for companies like Digitech, like Lexicon, I believe that's the case, has done some really fine work, and I think they're some of the best reverbs on the market, certainly at this price range anyway. Comparable on here, I don't necessarily find the same amount of joy in the reverb tones, but I will say I think this is a bit easier to dial in amp tones on, and certainly the cab section of this I think is better, specifically because you can do combinations of mic on the same cab, so you can have like this mix 1, mix 2, mix 3, and in the PC editor it actually tells you what those combinations are. It doesn't tell you on the unit itself, slight downside, but you can have combinations of microphones on one cab, on a single cab, and then you can also position the mic much like what we see you can do in the Helix now, but that's not the case in the Pod Go at the moment, and I'm not sure if that's coming over or not. So the cab section of the HoTone Ampero Stomp, I think I prefer. In this video I was actually using an IR on the Pod Go, but I use the cab section on the HoTone Ampero because I think it's really decent, and you can actually, because you can move mics around, you can dial in tones quite well with the cab section that you've got on here. Now, there's one key area which I think the Pod Go has some advantages, and that would be if you're using these things live, then actually having this amount of foot switching is infinitely more useful than having just 3, I think, personally. And so if that was a key area for me, I think I would be leaning towards the Pod Go, because having these switches really does make all the difference when you're playing live. And this has snapshots, which the HoTone Ampero does not. So what this kind of has is a little bit of a slightly-ish confusing thing where you can assign sort of different things to a foot switch, so sort of like snapshots, but not exactly the same, and a little bit more difficult to dial in, whereas with these you just press down and move your parameter to get the snapshot that you're looking for. And so the Helix ecosystem snapshots thing, I think, is the easiest thing to work with across the whole of the modeling world at the moment, until someone else comes up with something maybe better than it. But for now, I think the idea of having 3 or 4 snapshots in a preset that you can just make your assignments as many as you like, and then have clean, drive, all these kind of things going on, I think that's an advantage towards the Pod Go. So snapshots and foot switching would be one area where I think the Pod Go has a clear advantage. And likewise, so if we talk about the experience of trying to think about how you would gig with the HoTone Ampero Stomp, what you'd have to do, I think I've put together a gigging preset, you'd have to assign maybe 1 or 2 things to a foot switch. Maybe you bring in an expression pedal to change the volume of delay or something like that. And what else could we do? Well, it's not as gig ready in my opinion. So if you were using this as part of a pedal board, I think you'd be fine. But also what I found is that it's not actually seamless switching between the modes either. So if you go to turn on a tuner or you go to do certain things, there's some sort of switching underneath which sometimes gets triggered. So for instance, using the looper live, you'd get dropouts when you switch into looper mode. Not great from that point of view. So I think it would just about be possible to maybe gig this if you set up the foot switches carefully, but the Pod Go is pretty easily ready to gig, and you know, thousands of guitarists around the world do it. You just set up your snapshots and it's really quite straightforward. Obviously, you've got an expression pedal built in as well, which is a benefit, although I think there are some negatives around the optic sensor. If you're using this outside, sometimes, especially in summer, I think people have had experience of them crapping out. Power supply wise, this one runs off 800 milliamps. This one runs off a 9 volt, 2.5 is saying amps. I think it probably runs off a bit less than that, but a little bit more difficult to power. Obviously, this is much more pedalboard friendly size, and the fact that you could do dual amping with it, I think is important. So I really think the HoTone punches above its weight in terms of tone. I think the amp models in there sound and feel really good to play. The negative that I have is that there's not this kind of gig ready mode, in my opinion. You kind of set these targets and all this sort of stuff, and you can sort of set up, well, you can definitely set up foot switching. So you could foot switch on a drive, you could foot switch on a delay, and one other thing, or you can change some elements of parameters. I think 4 parameters with one switch. So you could, in theory, set these things up, but I think it might take a little bit of a while. Tonally, I think the HoTone Ampero Stomp really does keep up with almost anything on the market. Tonally, I think the Line 6 Podgo with the stock cabs is a little bit maybe more difficult to dial in, but once you get it dialed in, I think it's pretty good. And of course, there is, for some folks, there has been the impedance kind of issue, which I think is no longer a conspiracy theory. I don't know, let me know your thoughts on that. But if you put a buffered, like a tuner in front of it, then you kind of don't have that issue anymore anyway. But if you were going to be gigging the thing, I would lean towards the Line 6 Podgo. And for me, having the snapshot ecosystem would be a real key benefit of the Podgo. If you weren't gigging, and if you wanted something a bit smaller, that still sounds really, really good, has the possibility of dual amping as well as a parallel path, so you can do interesting kind of effects things with this that wouldn't be so possible with the Podgo. Dual amping, experimental kind of reverbs on different paths and that sort of stuff. I think if you're looking for that sort of thing, I might go for the Ampero Stomp. But if you're thinking, well, I want to be able to gig this thing potentially, then I think the Podgo might be a way to go. But above all, I would probably recommend the HX Stomp, to be honest. But that's not exactly what the video is about. But I think if you like the intro there or listen to those tones, that was with relatively similar effects change, you know, using a plexi jumped with a distortion pedal in front and a bit of compression and a bit of delay. I think you could hear that both of them can be dialed in to sound really good, especially if you start using IRs with either of them. So, you know, which would you pick would be my question. This actually has a touch screen, so there's a benefit as well, I guess, if you're into touching screens. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are you a HoTone person who's really enjoyed these? I do, every time I plug it in, get a lot of joy out of the tones you can get out of them. The Podgo can sometimes be a little bit hit or miss for me in terms of, does it always get exactly where I want it to go tone-wise? But with a bit of patience, I think it can get there. Catch you in another video soon. If you want either of those presets, I think you can get the Podgo one in the Gumroad link, and there's probably a PayPal link for the HoTone. But yeah, let me know your thoughts.